Chapter 1. The Trigger. Ambassador Lyra Kincaid stood before the panoramic window of her office, watching Earth's serene blue and green hues stretch across the vastness of space. The hum of the station behind her seemed distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the quiet peace of the planet below. For years, she had fought to maintain this tranquility, humanity's hard-won place in the galactic community. As Earth's lead diplomat, it had been her life's work to ensure that peace endured. Her hands rested on the cool glass, fingers trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. The message had come through in the middle of the night, a burst of distress that fractured the quiet. A massacre, a human colony on the outer rim, child casualties among the dead. A fleet of Imperial ships had descended, and the aftermath was nothing short of a nightmare. The Empire had attacked with brutality, no warning, no provocation. All civilian targets. All of them. No reason but dominance. And they had left nothing but ashes. Ambassador Kincaid? The voice of her assistant, Jalen, snapped Lyra from her reverie. He entered the room, holding a datapad with a grim expression. She knew what it contained before he even spoke. Not just a massacre, Jalen, Lyra said, her voice cold but laced with disbelief. They slaughtered children. Jalen swallowed, avoiding her gaze. The numbers are still coming in, but it's worse than we thought. The news is spreading across the colonies. People are panicking. Lyra turned sharply to face him, her dark eyes narrowing. Who authorized this? I want names. I want to know how something like this could have happened. She demanded it with quiet fury, though her insides churned with something darker, something beyond anger. Emperor Idrax's forces, ambassador. It's a message, a warning. Lyra's throat tightened. She knew the Empire's reputation for ruthlessness, their methods of keeping weaker systems in line, but this was something else entirely. They had never been this savage, not this indiscriminate. How many dead? She asked, her words heavy. Jalen hesitated before answering. We're estimating over 3,000 civilians and at least 1,000 children. The images, he trailed off, clearly struggling to continue. Lyra's stomach twisted. The numbers, though horrific, couldn't capture the soul-shattering weight of it all. These weren't just bodies on a battlefield. These were families, lives snuffed out in the most vicious way possible. For what? To break the spirit of the human race? To prove a point? We need to respond, she muttered, more to herself than to Jalen. Now. Immediately, Jalen shifted uncomfortably, the datapad still clutched in his hands. We've already sent word to the Imperial emissary for an explanation. The council has been convened. Everyone's waiting for your input. She didn't need to hear more. Lyra knew what the council would debate. They would hesitate. They would argue for peace, for diplomacy. The usual rhetoric. But there was no more room for that. There was no negotiation with monsters. Not anymore. I'll address them. Call them in. I'll be in the council chamber in 10. Jalen nodded quickly and left. Lyra stood still for a moment, looking once again at Earth. It was still beautiful. It hadn't changed, but she had. She turned sharply, pulling herself from her thoughts, her determination solidifying. Today, the facade of diplomacy would fall. She would not bow to this. She couldn't. Chapter 2. The Decision. Lyra sat at her desk. The hum of the chamber's lights overhead almost drowned out by the frantic beating of her heart. Her hands, clasped together tightly, rested on the surface of the sleek, metallic table. She had just finished addressing the council, but now she sat alone in the cold, sterile space of her office, the weight of her decision pressing heavily against her chest. The decision to declare war had been made, but not without its cost. A storm of conflicting emotions swirled inside her. Anger, guilt, sorrow. She had always prided herself on diplomacy, the delicate art of negotiation, of peace. But now that path felt like an old, broken promise. The massacre had obliterated any chance of reconciliation with the Galactic Empire. How could there be peace when children had been murdered in their own homes? Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint chime of her communicator. She glanced at the screen. General Darius Holt's name flashed across the display. A sigh escaped her lips, the only sign of the pressure mounting within her. "Lyra," the general's voice came through, rough but steady. "The military is ready for your command." Lyra leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the desk. She had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "I haven't given the command yet, Darius," she replied. Her voice was sharp, the edge of frustration creeping in. "I can't just jump into a war without careful consideration. This will change everything." "Understand," Holt responded, his tone softening. "But you've made your choice, and so have I. You said you would do whatever it took to protect Earth and its people. You'll need to act soon before the Empire takes full advantage of the situation." She bit her lip, her mind racing. She knew the Empire's response would be swift, devastatingly so. Their fleets were vast, their power unquestionable. Earth, despite its technological advancements, was far from ready for a full-scale war. Yet Holt was right. If they waited too long, humanity's resolve might crumble beneath the weight of fear. "I'll be at the War Council in 20, Lyra said, standing from her desk and grabbing the edge of her jacket. She adjusted the fabric, taking one last glance at the Earth through her office window before turning away. "Get the strategy team ready. We're going to need everything we have." The War Council room was a far cry from the sterile calm of her office. The room hummed with activity as military leaders and strategists shuffled around, finalizing battle plans and adjusting coordinates. Lyra walked in, and the room immediately quieted, all eyes on her. Holt stood at the far end, his usual confident posture rigid today, the seriousness of the moment clearly weighing on him as well. He met her gaze, offering a brief nod of solidarity before turning back to the team. "We've been discussing our first strike," Holt began, his voice carrying the full weight of his position. "We need to hit them fast, hit them hard. The longer we wait, the more time the Empire has to regroup." Lyra nodded, her mind already calculating the risks. "Agreed. But we can't afford to be reckless. We need precision, or we risk more civilian casualties. The last thing we want is to show the galaxy that we're no better than the Empire." Holt's eyes flashed with a flicker of doubt, but he quickly suppressed it. "I'll have the attack ready to go, but you need to make the call, Ambassador. This is your war now. The people are waiting for you to lead them." Lyra glanced around the room at the faces of the officers who had served under her in the past. Their expressions were hardened, but beneath that was a quiet, almost reverent trust. They believed in her. She had earned that trust through years of diplomacy, through navigating the galaxy's delicate web of alliances. But this was different. There would be no negotiations this time. This would be war. "Darius, I need you to give me the plan," Lyra said, her voice quiet but firm. "What are we looking at?" Holt turned to the large holographic display behind him, which flickered to life, showing a detailed map of the galactic sector. The Imperial Empire's territory was vast, and Earth's position in the outer rim made them a relatively insignificant player in the grand scheme of things. But now they were the focal point. "We start with the main Imperial fleet stationed above the Shera system," Holt said, pointing to a large cluster of red icons on the map. "They've been responding to reports of uprisings on the outer planets, but they won't expect a full-scale attack from Earth. We'll hit their supply routes, their communication relays, take out their infrastructure one piece at a time, disrupt their command structure. With the element of surprise, we might have a chance to break through before they can respond with their full force." Lyra studied the map, her mind calculating. She knew it would be a risky move. There was no guarantee they would succeed. The Empire's strength had always been their overwhelming numbers, their unrelenting assault. But the Empire had underestimated humanity once before, and Lyra had made it clear Earth would not bow. "I'll authorize the first strike," she said, her voice now colder, more determined. "But I want no more casualties than necessary. This is a message to them, not to the galaxy." Holt gave a brief nod of acknowledgement before turning back to the team. "Prepare for the operation. We move within the hour." Back in her private quarters, Lyra allowed herself a moment of respite. The decision had been made, and the next few days would determine Earth's fate. There was no going back now. Her thoughts drifted to her children, Kara and Liam. She hadn't seen them in weeks, too caught up in the whirlwind of politics and diplomacy. She missed them more than she cared to admit. If Earth lost this war, if the Empire crushed them, what would happen to them? To all of humanity? She pushed the thought away, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. There was no room for weakness, no room for self-doubt. She was the leader now, and she had to make choices that would define the future. Her communicator buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from the Council. Lyra, Vice-Chancellor Westbrook's voice crackled through the device. We've received word from the Imperial emissaries. They demand an immediate ceasefire. They're threatening retribution if we don't surrender. Lyra's lips curled into a bitter smile. Tell them we're past the point of negotiations. She ended the call before Westbrook could respond, knowing full well that her decision had irrevocably changed everything. The Empire wouldn't back down, and neither would Earth. Lyra stood before the window once more, watching Earth spin silently in the void. She had chosen war, not out of hate, but out of necessity. The Empire had made their intentions clear, and now Earth would respond in kind. It was no longer about survival. It was about proving that humanity could stand tall, even in the face of annihilation. And Lyra Kincaid would ensure that they did. Chapter 3. Total War. Lyra stood before the command console, her fingers brushing over the cold, metallic surface, as if the touch would somehow ground her. The vast war room was bustling with activity, military officers rushing from station to station, preparing for Earth's first official strike against the Empire. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a mixture of determination and anxiety. It felt like a pulse, every thrum vibrating through the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The map on the central screen flickered briefly before stabilizing, displaying the Imperial strongholds scattered across the galaxy. Lyra had seen the plan, and it was as daring as it was dangerous. Their goal was simple: cripple the Empire's communication and supply lines, strike first, and make the Empire understand that humanity would no longer be a silent observer in the galaxy. The strategy was predicated on speed. Hit hard, hit fast, and retreat before the full weight of Imperial retribution could be brought to bear. She turned as General Darius Holt approached, his expression grim but resolute. The weight of command hung heavy on his broad shoulders. "It's time," he said, his voice low, controlled. "The fleet is in position. We're ready to move on your orders." Lyra nodded, her mind racing through the final calculations. She had spent the last 24 hours poring over every detail, every contingency. Earth's forces were strong, but not as strong as the Empire's. They had no choice but to rely on speed and cunning. There was no room for hesitation. "Give the order," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "We move now." Holt hesitated for a moment before tapping a sequence on his wrist console, sending the command to the fleet. The first wave of ships, small but heavily armed strike craft, would breach the Imperial defensive perimeter with surgical precision. If all went according to plan, they would disable key Imperial stations and buy Earth the precious time it needed to regroup and counterattack. "We're counting on you," Lyra said quietly, more to herself than to Holt. "Don't let us down." "I'll make sure of it," he replied with a nod, before turning to address his officers, issuing final orders. Hours later, Lyra watched the battle unfold from the war room's observation deck. The view was a stark contrast to the serene image of Earth she had once known. Now, the black void of space was lit by the glow of lasers and explosions, the violent dance of warfare playing out like an intricate, deadly ballet. The fleet had struck swiftly, bypassing the majority of the Imperial defenses by targeting less obvious entry points, trade routes, minor outposts, and communication relays. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon, and so far, it had worked. The first wave of strikes had crippled several key stations in the Imperial supply chain. Yet, the Empire's response had been swift as well. Even as Lyra watched, a massive Imperial fleet began to mobilize, their ships appearing on the sensors like a wave cresting over the horizon. "They've detected our presence," Lieutenant Rojas said, glancing at the readings flashing across his console. "Imperial reinforcements are on the way." They'll be here within the hour. Lyra clenched her jaw. They had anticipated a quick response, but not this quick. The Empire would not let Earth's defiance go unanswered. They were too proud, too powerful to allow a small, rebellious planet to challenge their might without retribution. Start the retreat, she ordered. Pull back to the secondary position. We need to regroup before they overwhelm us. The retreat was not as smooth as they had hoped. As Earth's fleet withdrew, Imperial warships appeared in the distance, closing the gap between them and the retreating ships. The speed and agility of the Imperial forces was unmatched. Each move calculated, each response precise. Lyra watched, her stomach twisting as a human destroyer ship veered sharply to avoid an incoming blast, only to be struck by a secondary wave of fire. It exploded into a massive ball of flame, its shattered remains drifting silently in the void. Casualties? Lyra asked, her voice tight. Too many, Rojas replied, his face pale. The second wave hit harder than we anticipated. We've lost several ships. Lyra's heart sank. This was the cost of war. She knew it, but seeing it, the lives lost, the ships destroyed, it made the decision feel heavier, more final. She had set this in motion, and there was no turning back now. Every life lost would be on her hands. We can't give up now, Lyra said, pushing the thought from her mind. Every ship we lose, every life, we make the Empire bleed for it. This isn't just about survival. This is about proving that we're not just a footnote in their empire. We're human, and we'll fight. The war room was quiet in the hours that followed. The only sound the soft hum of consoles and the steady breathing of the officers around her. Lyra stared at the map on the screen, her mind moving through scenarios, calculations, and military strategies as the retreat continued. Every choice she made seemed to bring a new consequence. Each victory, a reminder of the cost. Her communicator buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from General Holt. "We're holding the line, Ambassador," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. "We've inflicted significant damage to the Empire's infrastructure, but they're regrouping quickly. We'll need reinforcements to continue the fight." Lyra glanced at the map, the red marks of Imperial forces multiplying by the second. The message was clear. They were outmatched. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Not much," Holt replied. "The Imperial fleet is mobilizing. If we don't move soon, we risk being surrounded." Lyra's fingers drummed against the edge of the table. Her thoughts were moving quickly now, sifting through options. They needed more firepower, more time, but there was only one way to ensure their survival. "Start the counteroffensive," she said, her voice suddenly resolute. "We go on the offensive. We force them to split their fleet. We use every available weapon we have." Holt's tone brightened, a note of surprise in his voice. "You're giving the order? We don't have time to hesitate anymore. We fight until we can't fight anymore. This is the price of defiance." Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the battle playing out before her. The initial strike had been successful, but now, it was clear, Earth was a long way from winning. Still, her decision had been made, and the fleet pressed on, relentless in their fight. With every passing minute, the human ships began to hit back harder, the Empire's overwhelming numbers countered by Earth's resilience. The retreat had slowed. Human forces weren't simply running anymore. They were striking back, forcing the Empire to bleed, inch by inch. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the attack had begun, Lyra felt a small, fragile flicker of hope. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in days, she felt a surge of something else, a growing certainty. This war, no matter the outcome, would change everything. The galaxy stood before the large viewing window in the war room, you said, the cold glass pressing against her palms. Her gaze swept across the expanse of space, where the scattered debris of the battle flickered in the darkness. Earth's fleet had retreated once again, but this time the lines were drawn, the stakes made clear. There would be no more half measures. The Empire had shown no mercy, and now Earth would answer in kind. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours, the relentless weight of command bearing down on her. Decisions, each one more painful than the last. The war had escalated beyond anything she had anticipated, and with each passing minute, humanity's survival seemed more uncertain. Yet there was no turning back. There would be no surrender. Not after what the Empire had done. Ambassador, General Holt's voice cut through her thoughts. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his face drawn with fatigue. His uniform was marked with the wear of battle, creased, stained, and frayed, but his eyes were sharp. He had never looked more like a man who had seen both the horrors and necessities of war. "We've had a communications intercept," Holt continued. "The Empire's leadership is convening. They've sent a direct message. They want to talk." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Talk." She almost laughed, but there was no humor in her voice. "After everything they've done, now they want to talk?" "Not just talk," Holt said, stepping closer. "They're offering terms. A ceasefire, an end to the conflict. They're willing to negotiate." "Negotiate," Lyra repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "After slaughtering innocent children, after destroying colonies. Now they want to negotiate?" Holt nodded gravely. "It's a strategy. They're trying to buy time. They know they're losing ground, and if they can force us into a ceasefire, they may have a chance to regroup. But I think they're worried." "Worried?" Lyra echoed. She paced in front of the large holographic map that dominated the room. The Empire's forces were massive, their warships nearly endless. But Earth had done the unthinkable. It had fought back, and it had made a difference. "They're underestimating us, Darius," she said, her voice low but firm. "They think we'll fold, but we won't. I won't." Holt paused, his eyes fixed on the map. "What do you want to do?" Lyra turned to face him, her expression hardening. "We don't stop now. We don't give them a chance to regroup. We're not negotiating anymore. We finish what we started." The general's eyes flickered with a momentary hesitation before he nodded. "Understood. I'll prep the fleet for another push." Lyra exhaled, the tension in her chest easing for the first time in days. She wasn't just fighting for Earth anymore. She was fighting for every colony, every life the Empire had taken, and for every future human who would live under the shadow of the Empire if they failed. The final battle was approaching, and Lyra knew the Empire would throw everything it had at them. She had made her decision. Earth would go on the offensive. The first wave of ships had already begun to rally, their engines powered up and ready for the fight. The War Council had outlined the strategy: divert their forces, draw the Empire into a fight they couldn't win, and give the human fleet the chance to strike where it hurt most. The fleet moved silently through the dark void of space. Each ship, from the smaller strike crafts to the massive battleships, was a symbol of humanity's defiance. This was not a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight to prove that humanity could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest power in the galaxy and survive. Lyra's communicator buzzed, and she answered it without hesitation. It was Holt again, his voice low but urgent. "We've detected the Empire's fleet. They're splitting off into smaller groups, likely trying to flank us. We need to act fast." "I'm already on it," Lyra replied. She quickly tapped the controls on her own console, sending the command to the fleet to break into smaller divisions. "We'll move to engage and to share a system. If we push them hard enough, we can force them into a choke point. We'll hit their supply line and isolate their reinforcements." Holt's voice crackled back through the comms. "Understood. We'll move on your signal." Hours later, the war was fully engaged. Lyra's fingers gripped the armrest of her command chair, her eyes locked on the chaotic battlefield unfolding on the holoscreen before her. The human fleet had divided, but every ship moved as one. Precision strikes, coordinated assaults, and overwhelming force, all directed at the weakest points in the Empire's defenses. Lyra watched as one of Earth's destroyers unleashed a volley of plasma rounds, taking down one of the Imperial frigates. The explosion was brilliant, too brilliant, almost, but it was a victory, a small one in the grand scope of the war. She focused on the details, the smaller victories that mattered most. Each Imperial ship destroyed, each line of defense shattered, was a step closer to the end. But it wasn't without cost. The human fleet was taking heavy damage. Ships were being torn apart by Imperial fire, the vast expanse of space littered with the wreckage of once proud vessels. The battle was not just a test of strength. It was a test of endurance, of spirit. Lyra felt every loss deeply, every ship lost, every life extinguished. "They're not backing down," Rojas said, his voice tense. "The Empire is throwing everything at us." "Good," Lyra replied, her voice tight but steady. "That means they're afraid. And when they're afraid, we win." As the battle raged on, Lyra's resolve only strengthened. She had seen firsthand the cost of this war, the pain, the loss, the suffering, but there was something else. There was an undeniable strength in humanity, a defiance in their very nature that even the Empire couldn't crush. They had pushed the Empire back, forced them to fight at every turn, and now they were on the verge of victory. But it would not come without sacrifice. The final push came just as Lyra had predicted. The Empire's fleet began to crumble under the weight of Earth's attacks, their reinforcements scattered, their command structure in disarray. The human fleet pressed forward, breaking through the remaining defenses with a determination that left the Empire reeling. "Victory is within our grasp." Holt's voice came through the comms, a note of triumph in his voice. "The Empire is retreating. They can't hold us off much longer." Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the battlefield. The fight wasn't over yet, but it was close. She could feel it in her bones. The end was near. For better or worse, humanity had taken its stand. The battle ended with the Empire's retreat. Earth had done the impossible. It had forced the Galactic Empire to retreat, to concede. But the cost was high. The remnants of the human fleet drifted back to Earth, battered and bruised, but victorious. Lyra's heart was heavy as she watched the ships return, their hulls scarred, their crews exhausted, but their spirits unbroken. As the war room filled with reports and calculations, Lyra found herself staring out into space once more. The war had not been without its losses, but it had been necessary. The Empire had underestimated them, and humanity had risen to the challenge. The war was over, for now, but the future was uncertain. One thing was clear. Earth had proven that, no matter the odds, humanity would never bow to tyranny. And Lyra Kincaid would ensure the. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. Lyra stood alone in the quiet of the war room, the distant hum of the cooling engines from Earth's fleet the only sound breaking the silence. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the screens scattered across the tables. She hadn't felt the weight of exhaustion like this before. Even in the thickest negotiations, in the most complex diplomatic crises, she had never carried the burden of so many lives lost. The war was over, but at what cost? Earth had struck a blow against the Galactic Empire, a blow that would resonate across the galaxy for generations. But what had they gained? The bodies of the fallen still haunted her, their faces always just out of reach. Each one a child, a parent, a future that had been violently ripped away. She could still hear the faint echoes of their cries, lingering in the corners of her mind. The door to the room slid open with a soft hiss, and General Holt entered, his expression tired but resolute. He gave her a solemn nod before moving toward the console. "Report," Lyra said without turning around. Holt took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the data that flashed across the screen. "The Empire has withdrawn from the Sheriff system. We've gained a significant foothold, and they're consolidating their forces on the outer rim. But they've sent a message. They're offering terms." Lyra didn't move. "Terms. Ceasefire," Holt said, his voice grave. "They want to end the war. A return to the status quo. They'll give up some of their key positions, but want Earth to pull back from the borders." Lyra's fingers tightened on the edge of the console, her nails digging into the cold metal. She had expected this, but the idea of negotiating again, of giving the Empire any semblance of control, made her stomach churn. The galaxy had watched as humanity stood up to the Empire, fought back, and taken territory. But would it be enough to change the Empire's ruthless ambitions? Would they truly stand down? Are we seriously considering this? Lyra's voice was tight, filled with an intensity she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the battle ended. Holt hesitated, his eyes flickering with indecision. "It's tempting, Lyra. We've won, but the cost." "Don't," she interrupted, turning to face him. We've lost so much already. Every victory came at the price of someone's life. The Empire doesn't want peace. They want to recover. They want to keep pushing us, waiting for us to relax, to believe the war is over. They'll never stop unless we make it clear that we won't allow them to dominate the galaxy. I agree, Holt said quietly, his gaze hardening. But we can't keep going like this. The fleet is stretched thin, and we've lost too many ships. Earth can't sustain this kind of war indefinitely. Lyra's eyes darkened. She had known this moment would come. The point where the pressure of war would make even the strongest voices crack. There were too many who wanted peace, too many who believed it was time to rebuild, to reforge alliances. But in her heart, Lyra knew that peace with the Empire was a lie. The people are tired, Holt continued. I know you want to keep fighting, but we have to consider what's best for Earth, for our future. If we push this further, we risk everything. Lyra's chest tightened. The weight of the decision was unbearable. The responsibility of choosing the future of an entire species pressing her to the edge. But there was one thing that had always driven her, the belief that humanity could no longer afford to be the underdog. They could no longer wait, could no longer beg for scraps from the Empire's table. They had to make their own path. No, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. We will not retreat. We will not accept anything less than a permanent shift in the balance of power. Holt regarded her silently for a moment, his face etched with concern. You're asking for another war, Lyra. A war that could destroy everything we've built. I'm asking for Earth's future, she said sharply. If we don't push now, they'll never stop coming for us. It's not just about survival. It's about ensuring that humanity has a place in this galaxy, a place where we're not just a footnote in the Empire's story. Holt nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. You're not wrong, he said, his voice quiet. But this time, we'll need allies. We won't survive another war like this without help. Lyra paused, her mind racing. She had always believed in Earth's strength, in its ability to stand against overwhelming odds. But she was right. They couldn't do this alone again. It was time to look beyond the borders of Earth, to find those who would stand with them. It was time to find their allies. The days following the Empire's ceasefire offer were tense. Lyra's decision was met with mixed reactions. The political council, in particular, was divided. Some factions argued for peace, urging a swift end to hostilities. Others, like Lyra, believed that only through continued pressure would the Empire be forced to truly change. The war had revealed something about humanity, something that couldn't be ignored. The resilience of Earth's people, the unity that had formed in the face of unimaginable violence, was something that no amount of imperial force could ever crush. And it was that unity, that fierce will, that would carry them forward. Lyra spent the following weeks in intense negotiations, not just with Earth's own leadership, but with alien species who had watched the conflict unfold. The victory against the Empire had made waves across the galaxy, and while the Empire's allies were reluctant to abandon their longtime partners, there was an undeniable shift in the balance of power. A meeting was called with the leaders of several galactic factions, the Xanthians, the Malarian Coalition, and the Trelkian Trade Confederacy. Earth had proven it could survive against the Empire, but now they needed to prove that they could thrive with the right alliances. The meeting was a gamble, but Lyra knew that if humanity was to build something more enduring than just resistance, they needed more than just military strength. They needed unity, a coalition that could stand against the Empire and any future threats. As she sat at the head of the table, surrounded by representatives from across the galaxy, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. The negotiations were long and difficult, but she could see the shift in the room. The Empire was no longer the unchallenged power it had once been. The tide had turned. When the final agreement was signed, Lyra allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The future was uncertain, but Earth was no longer a passive participant in Galaxy. They had earned their place, not through submission, but through defiance, through sacrifice, and through unwavering resolve. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and they had paid the price. But the true cost of victory was yet to be fully understood. The aftermath of the war, with all its scars and losses, was still fresh in her mind. There would be no return to innocence, no simple peace. But Earth had proven something fundamental, that in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity could not only survive. They could rise.